Let's talk about one of my favorite new urban fantasies, Kevin Hearne's Hounded. It's the first book in the Iron Druid Chronicles, and it's Hearne's first published novel, and it entered the publishing world with a splash. This book has reached a lot of people. It's really popular. You can find it on most bookstore shelves. So it's a great example of how to get started in the publishing industry. I'm Caitlin Burby, editor and writer. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping writers like you impact readers in the way Kevin Hearne's Hounded does. Hearne's novel is a true page-turner. It has an interesting cast of magical creatures and uses humor very effectively. All of this contributes to its success as a novel. The first aspect of Hounded I want to talk about is the humor of Atticus O'Sullivan. Hounded is narrated by Atticus O'Sullivan, an ancient druid who finds joy in the little things in life. If it hadn't been told from the first-person point of view of Atticus, we wouldn't get to see Atticus's inner wit, his telepathic communication with his Irish wolfhound and other creatures, and we would lose some of the jokes and the positive tone the novel has. Atticus's humor is present right off the bat. This is the second paragraph of the novel. Thank the goddess I don't look like a guy who met Galileo, or who saw Shakespeare's plays when they first debuted, or rode with the hordes of Genghis Khan. When people ask how old I am, I just tell them 21. And if they assume years instead of decades or centuries, then that can't be my fault, can it? I still get carded, in fact, which any senior citizen will tell you is immensely flattering. This paragraph isn't just about showing Atticus's humor. Hearne also reveals his age and a bit of his backstory. This is an example of doing more than one thing at a time in your writing to keep your readers interested and invested. Atticus's humor isn't just designed to entertain readers. It's a part of his character. It's one of the ways he deals with pain and with conflict in his life. When he's confronted with a threat or a difficult situation, he often responds with a witty comment. This is his way of dealing with it and making the situation more manageable. So it's central to his character. When an aspect of the writing, like humor in Hounded, becomes a part of the character, the plot, and a story, it becomes more real to readers. And therefore, they find it more believable and they find it more engaging. Humor is woven throughout Hounded to amuse the readers, to lighten the story, and to deepen Atticus's character. The second aspect of Hounded I want to discuss is the unique cast of characters: druids, Celtic goddesses, and elementals. When a fantasy novel focuses on vampires, werewolves, and evil sorcerers, it becomes predictable because these magical creatures are so well known in our current society. When you step outside of that usual canon of magical characters, then your work becomes fresh and new. Your world and your characters are more interesting to your readers because they can't really predict what they're going to do and how they're going to respond to situations like they can with vampires, werewolves, and sorcerers. This gives authors more freedom, and it gives them another tool to create mystery, suspense, tension, betrayal, surprise, all of these aspects of a story that you don't want your readers to guess ahead of time. Hounded still uses traditional magical creatures. It still has vampires, werewolves, and witches. They're just not the primary characters. The main character, Atticus O'Sullivan, is a druid. His main antagonist is a Celtic god. There are also furbogs, Celtic goddesses, and elementals. Hearne is able to mix a lot of magical creatures together by comparing and contrasting certain magical systems and beliefs. So he pits the earth-based magic of druids against the darker arts of witchcraft. And then he pits a witty druid against a powerful Celtic god to see what happens. At the same time, he's contrasting the beliefs of the modern age with the beliefs of the Iron Age. And we're seeing how these characters change or don't over time. This also makes his world more interesting and less predictable. It does the same thing for his characters. One of the greatest strengths of Hounded is how it highlights these less well-known magical creatures and at the same time tips its hat to the more traditional ones found in urban fantasies. The last aspect of Hounded I want to talk about is how it's a page-turner. When a book has excellent pacing and an intriguing story and keeps readers up until well past midnight, it's a page-turner. It's something your readers cannot put down, and this is a quality most writers want to have in their story. Hounded does this by strategically placing the chapter breaks. Oftentimes, authors are told to end the chapter on a cliffhanger, to force your readers to read the next chapter and not put your book down. While this can be effective, it can also be annoying. Instead of doing that, Hearne puts the chapter breaks right after the climax, but before the resolution. So you still get a sense of satisfaction at the climax having ended in each chapter. But the scene isn't over. Something could still happen. So you want to keep reading to find out what does happen. An example of this is the transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2. Here are those two sentences. Chapter 1. I got a brief message from the Iron Elemental before it faded away in the short bursts of emotion and images they use for language. Druid calls, fairies await, delicious gratitude. Chapter 2. I looked around to see who might have witnessed the fight, but there wasn't anyone close by. It was lunchtime. This is a continuous scene, but the fight has already concluded at the end of chapter 1, so the reader feels satisfied. We don't get Atticus's idea of the end of the fight, though, what he's thinking, until the beginning of chapter 2. That's how Hearne pulls his readers along in each chapter, instead of creating annoying cliffhangers every time. I also want to note that a page-turner is not an action-packed novel on overdrive. A page-turner is more of a marathon than a sprint. It ebbs and it flows. It has the up and down pacing of a good novel. Hearne does this by contrasting the action with the humor of Atticus, and he uses those less intense moments to really deepen his characters while still entertaining his readers and still moving the plot along. Readers need those breathers so they don't become exhausted and overwhelmed by your book. It's also important because when you go from a really low calm scene to a really intense action scene, it's more effective than going from intense scene to intense scene to intense scene where your readers never get to go down and then back up again. This pacing Hearne creates and his strategic chapter breaks are part of what makes Hounded a page-turner. Finally, I'd like to leave you with a few editor's notes on Kevin Hearne's Hounded. I read a wide variety of stories. I read experimental and traditional, multiple types of genres. I like comedies and tragedies. But recently I've been drawn to books that have a unique and engaging sense of humor. And Hounded has this. When humor is done well, it comes across as easy and simple. It's actually one of the most difficult things to pull off in writing, though. Everyone has a different sense of humor. What one person might find funny, another might find insulting. So it's really difficult to create a humorous story that appeals to a wide variety of people. Hounded does this by keeping the humor positive and by keeping it a part of the character and the story itself instead of just a funny comment meant to make readers laugh. If you want to use humor in your story, think about it in that way. How can you make it an integral part instead of just something you stick in there to give your readers a quick laugh? Writing a page-turner is equally difficult. There are many aspects that you can point out about books that have page-turner quality, like the strategic chapter breaks in Hounded and the good pacing. But there's always this intangible element to them as well, and that's the part of them that is just a really good story. It's often difficult to define. A lot of times readers can point to a book and say that's a page-turner, but they can't tell you why. That's also what makes it successful, is the techniques you're using to create the page-turner shouldn't be noticeable by your readers. Through humor, strategic chapter breaks, and the intrigue of using less well-known magical creatures, Hearne is able to create a page-turner in Hounded. By studying the techniques he uses, other writers can learn how to create page-turners as well. If you found this video helpful, please like below. I'd love to know what you thought about Hounded, and to hear any recommendations you have of books that have interesting magical creatures, are a page-turner, or have a unique sense of humor. Share them in the comments below. Subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing for more videos like this, designed to help you impact your readers. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. Now it's your turn. See how you can use humor, an interesting cast of magical creatures, and pacing and strategic chapter breaks to ignite your ink.